Hey, welcome back, everyone. Well, I'm going to go into some interesting stuff today. I want to talk about the plans that are being worked on right now to block out the sun. And no, this is not The Simpsons and Mr. Burns planning to block out the sun. This is about individuals, including Bill Gates, financing research at Harvard University, research being done, being backed by the World Economic Forum for giant space bubbles. I'm not even joking. And very weird things like this. This ties into solar geoengineering, is the technical word for blocking out the sun. And part of the idea is to mimic the effect of volcanic ash. If there were to be a large volcanic explosion, there would be volcanic ash that would block out the sun. And that's happened in history. It's credited with killing many, many, many millions of people. But I'll get into this today and how they're actually looking into this. And one of the this has been around for a bit now, so I want to get into some of the history on it. But I also want to talk about some of the latest things on it, because right now they're trying to figure out how to create policy to manage this type of act. That policy is not about banning it. That I should be clear on this. The policy is not about banning it. The policy that they're looking into is making sure that not just anybody can do it. They want to make sure that there's just a few select people who can do it, which would include, very likely, the individuals we'll be talking about today. Just as a caveat to this, I'm not getting into conspiracy territory. I'm going to be sticking strictly to scientific journals, scientific papers, direct websites of these organizations, and to even some establishment media that are talking about this. So that said, let's get into it. That said, though, folks, let's get into what's happening right now with this idea of solar geoengineering. And it touches on some other issues of geoengineering as well. Things to, for example, remove CO2 from the air, something that might be a bit detrimental to plant life, but they are developing technologies for that as well. Let's get into it, folks. Now, first of all, just talking about this, it's bizarre because it gets into territory that I think a lot of people do write off just instinctively. One of the big ones being that Bill Gates is financing chemical trails delivered by airplanes to blot out the sun. And people, when they hear that, they think, isn't a chemical trail left by an airplane, vapors in the stratosphere, isn't that a chemtrail? And think what you will. I'm going to show you their actual papers on this stuff. They're claiming this is different because people think chemtrails are left by airplanes, when in reality you would need to go much higher into the stratosphere to have anything stay very long. Now, scientists are noting these are not chemtrails. This is just technology they're building to leave chemical trails in the sky delivered by airplanes, which would control the weather by blotting out the sun. I'm not even joking. Let me show you, but first, this story from Bloomberg. And this is recent. This is from February. Bloomberg said this: "What if we blotted out the sun to fight global warming?" This is Bloomberg News. And Bloomberg is saying, "We like to think we cover the big stories around here, so today's newsletter is leading with the one question on everyone's mind. What is Tom Brady doing in retirement? What can be done to stop the slow climate change? One of the great hopes is something called solar geoengineering." And get used to that keyword, folks, because that's what they call it. Solar geoengineering. And they say it's essentially an attempt to figure out a way to cool the planet by deflecting some of the sun's rays before they reach us humans. The science isn't there just yet, but a group of scientists argue it should be banned now. And they are not wrong that it is a risky and last resort proposition. Clara, one of these researchers, argues it's terrifying and terrible in the way that chemotherapy is. We don't want it, but can we deny ourselves the possibility? Now, that's where the caveat with this is. And I want to be clear as we go into the way they're trying to regulate it. There are groups right now calling for certain bans on solar geoengineering, but the important part with that is that they're not really talking about banning it outright, but talking about regulating it. They're not talking about getting rid of it. The way of regulating it would essentially mean that they allow it, but they have maybe certain different regulations countries have to follow and so on that would make it more difficult were someone to do this. Now, folks, a bit further into this, and I debated on whether I should even do this episode because, frankly, I think people just instinctively think this stuff is crazy. I personally would think this stuff is crazy, but people are doing crazy things these days, and there's no getting around it. And you have some major organizations backing this technology. And let me show you, I mentioned that they're talking about banning it. The new debate right now, what makes this kind of a news story, is they're talking about banning it. But again, there's a caveat to that. I think it's extremely misleading when media say they're talking about banning it, because if you read the content of what they're actually saying, they are not talking about banning it. This is creating government protocols and government regulations on it that will still allow it. Let me show you another story on it. This is Bloomberg again. It says solar geoengineering research is a risk worth taking. In other words, while they might ban the deployment of it, they're still allowing the research on it, to at least currently. And they're saying this, right? It starts with this apocalyptic scene that Bloomberg is laying out. And they say apocalyptic scene is open. The Ministry of the Future, the latest novel by science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson. India is hit with a calamitous heat wave. One so sweltering with humidity so high that bodies struggle to sweat and therefore to survive. Thousands die in the sun-heated waters of a lake where they had sought refuge. In the end, 20 million perish. And they say further in, solar geoengineering covers a range of proposals to cool the Earth by reflecting some sunlight back into space, including with stratospheric aerosol injection, as in Robinson's novel. Now, let me get a bit deeper into this. So basically they're using a novel right now to predict what global warming, I guess they don't call it, they call it climate change now, what climate change might look like were climate change to ever cause the apocalyptic scene they believe it will. I won't get into the loopholes within climate change because that needs a whole episode. Maybe I'll get on some experts to talk about that. But they're using essentially what is a conspiracy theory, frankly, an actual debunked conspiracy theory in the truest sense of the word, climate change, as the basis to create technologies, ironically, that could probably kill a large number of people on the planet, funny enough. And the important part with this is they're not talking about banning the practice. Again, let me show you this, right? WIRES, this is one of the organizations on this, one of the papers on this. It says Solar Geoengineering, the case for an international non-use agreement. And let me show you kind of what the technicalities are of the alleged ban, because it's not really a ban. This is regulations to prevent the use of it, at least immediately, but to allow research on how to do it. The important part is they would not want to launch this immediately were they to do it. They would have this basically sitting on the side like the nuclear bomb in case the climate emergency ever struck and they felt the need to deploy it. Now it says this: solar geoengineering is gaining prominence in climate change debates as an issue worth studying. For some, it is even a potential future policy option. We argue here against this increasing normalization of solar geoengineering as a speculative part of the climate policy portfolio. We contend in particular that solar geoengineering at planetary scale is not governable in a globally inclusive and just manner within the current international political system. So they're saying it would need to be done with equity. It needs to be inclusive. One part of the world cannot be affected differently than another part of the world. We all need to suffer the slings and arrows of climate policy together, is what they're saying. And they say, we therefore call upon governments of the United Nations to take immediate and effective policy control over the development of solar geoengineering technologies. They want the United Nations to step in as the global manager for technologies on solar geoengineering. Now, they state further in something that I found to be very curious, because they talk about other technologies they're developing similar to this, but frankly don't get nearly as much attention. It says solar geoengineering differs from an alternative set of technologies that would remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Something that, again, they call carbon dioxide in the atmosphere the cause of global warming, climate change. But of course, many things rely on carbon dioxide to breathe, like plants, which would be extremely detrimental to the world were they to just suck all the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But that's another issue. But they say both approaches are sometimes together referred to geoengineering or climate engineering. So if you hear the terms geoengineering or climate engineering, this is what they're talking about. And they say our focus here is solely on solar geoengineering. And further in, they state this. In other words, they're not even addressing the idea of sucking the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They say the most prominent proposal is the injection of aerosols into the atmosphere to inhibit the influx of solar energy. And further in, they state the idea of solar geoengineering is gaining traction in a few industrialized countries. In March 2021, for instance, a report by a committee of U.S. National Academy of Sciences concluded that the United States should establish, ideally in international collaboration, a research program to assess the feasibility of solar geoengineering as a stopgap measure for addressing anthropogenic climate change. That's the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine 2021. Individual researchers in the United States have called for a globally organized, mission-driven research program on solar geoengineering, and for a special IPCC report on this topic. Harvard University has set up a solar geoengineering research program that plans, among others, a stratospheric controlled perturbation experiment to study the behavior of stratospheric aerosols. What does that mean? They want to fly big airplanes and leave chemical trails that spraying aerosols into the atmosphere that will have a reflective property to them that can stay in the atmosphere for about a year. Ironically, because those of you, probably most of us here, probably remember the early days of the climate change narrative where they said there was a hole in the ozone layer and it was being caused by aerosols. You'd think that spraying aerosols directly into the stratosphere would make the problem worse if what they're claiming is actually true, right? Why would you, if aerosols were burning a hole in the ozone layer, as we were told most of the time I was growing up at least, why would they spray aerosols like directly into the thing that they're trying to protect from aerosols? It doesn't make any logical sense, but that's what they're saying. Again, the logical sense is that, frankly, the narrative's a bunch of nonsense, but it's another topic. And they say this as well. In short, in some expert circles, solar geoengineering is now seen as a legitimate research topic and potential future climate change policy option or climate policy option. That's the official stance, folks. This is now viewed by many organizations, and there's proposals to have the United Nations manage it directly, as a future climate policy option. And they are developing the technologies for this. Now, as the report mentions, this isn't also just about blotting out the sun. This is also, again, climate engineering and other types of geoengineering, including removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And as a brief caveat to this, let me show you that program, because I want to just briefly mention that one and then go back into solar geoengineering. But just to kind of show you the other technologies being worked on alongside this, there are other things as well. Science Daily in 2021 had an article about this. They say effectively removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And Science Daily says this: researchers at the Paul Schuer Institute, PSI, and ETH Zurich have investigated the extent to which direct capture of carbon dioxide, CO2, from the ambient air can help to effectively remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. The result? With careful planning, for example, with regard to location and provision of the necessary energy, CO2 can be removed in a climate-effective manner. The researchers have now published their analysis in the journal Environmental Science and Technology. Further in, they state direct air carbon capture and storage. That's what they call it. Direct air carbon capture and storage, or DACCs, DACCS. They say it is a comparatively new technology for removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, since it would allow large amounts of CO2 to be, in effect, trapped. This technology could also reduce the greenhouse effect. Now, I should note that most of this is, of course, just, again, basically a big climate apocalypse conspiracy theory, that they believe this stuff is causing a disaster when actual data over the course of a long period of time shows it's not. But regardless, this conspiracy theory, which is what it is being used to create really destructive technologies, things that if deployed could have detrimental effects on the earth, on plant life, and on human life. And let me show you some of what's being worked on. I want to show you the actual technology Bill Gates is launching with this, or planning to launch with this. Bill Gates' involvement with this and there's many groups involved, but he's directly financing some of the research being done at Harvard, the one on deploying aerosols into the stratosphere. I don't know if YouTube's going to ban us for this, honestly. But look, I'm not even showing you any kind of conservative media. I'm only showing you today establishment media. You know, CNBC is the one that actually has a story on Bill Gates' plan with this. And I'm only showing you scientific journals and scientific papers. So I'm not getting into anything that I believe is controversial, but you never know with YouTube. That being said, I think we should jump exclusively to Epic TV because YouTube has been coming at our throats lately, unfortunately. But, again, folks, one of the reasons why we made Epic TV in the first place was because YouTube was censoring us. They've already given us a strike not too long ago, and they just out of the blue completely deleted the Crossroads Highlights channel. And so I would like to keep the Crossroads main channel for as long as possible, because I know a lot of you do watch it there. But really, there's a lot we cannot talk about on YouTube. So if you want to stick with this, come over to Epic TV, because I'm going to cut exclusively to Epic TV now, so I don't have to walk a fine line with YouTube if we do that. So let's jump over, and then I'm going to show you the video that CNBC actually has, the promo video on how this technology would be deployed. Literally, ironically, doing what the conspiracy theorists claim people are doing, which is spraying chemical trails directly into the atmosphere. In fact, the idea of using chemicals, especially in drinking water, as a way to, to social engineer people. This is real stuff that actually the Soviets had a lot of research on. There's actually a book that's currently not published, I know, by a researcher, actually the guy who did Red Cocaine, Joseph Douglas. Spent a very long time researching and wrote a full book on this. Unfortunately, he died right before it got published. But I know his wife, or his widow, is planning to release it, and I know the editor of it. But the Soviets did have programs directly on how to create chemicals and measuring how these chemicals could affect people psychologically and physically, and basically deploy this in drinking water to, weaken populations. They were doing this stuff, which is wild in my opinion. Let me talk about what Bill Gates is doing, and let me show you an actual video, because we're talking about, again, solar geoengineering, the idea that you could deploy aerosols into the stratosphere and by doing so mimic the effects of a volcanic ash, which would then reflect a certain amount of the sun's sunlight back into space, thereby denying sunlight to an extent to the Earth's surface. This is real stuff. This is CNBC in 2019, and I'm just going to play this video for you so you can see exactly what they're talking about. Let me show you this.
Burning across Brazil's Amazon rainforest has prompted renewed global outcry over climate change and big spending. $5 million from Leonardo DiCaprio, £10 million from the UK. Meanwhile, Bill Gates is backing the first high-altitude experiment of one radical climate change solution, creating a massive chemical cloud that could cool the Earth. It's called solar geoengineering, and it's highly controversial.
How long will it be that countries keep experiencing these climate impacts before someone gets desperate and says, hey, we need to cool the planet with solar geoengineering.
It would look something like this. Thousands of planes would fly very high and use nozzles to inject millions of tons of light-reflecting particles into the stratosphere. It would create a thin chemical cloud of those particles around the whole planet, blocking some sunlight from reaching the surface. It would mimic a giant volcanic eruption, which we know cools the Earth. Back in 1991, Mount Pinatubo erupted in the Philippines. It was the largest eruption to affect a densely populated area, creating avalanches and giant mud flows that left more than 700 dead and 30,000 homeless. It also spewed a cloud of 20 million tons of sulfur dioxide particles into the stratosphere. That chemical cloud was hundreds of miles across and reflected about 2% of sunlight back to space. And in 1992, the Earth was cooler than in 1991.
That is part of the mechanism, but you do this in a controlled way.
Modeling studies have found that it could reduce the intensity of heat waves, for instance. Apparently, it could reduce the rate of sea level rise. It could reduce the intensity of tropical storms.
But it also comes with significant risks and uncertainties.
Things like mass famine, mass flooding, drought, of kinds that will affect very large populations.
It could weaken monsoons in India, China, and Africa enough to affect crops. It could eradicate blue sky.
You start increasing the amount of diffuse light and you have less direct light, which is the same thing as saying it looks hazy and white.
So, folks, it might eradicate blue sky. That's a fancy way of saying that when you look up at the sky and you see that pretty blue, it might eradicate that. There will be no more blue skies. They're also saying it could affect crops, well, obviously, because crops need sunlight. And it could cause other things like famine and so on. But Bill Gates is currently testing it, as you saw in the video. The idea would be to fly thousands of airplanes in the sky and spray chemical aerosols into the stratosphere, which would stay there roughly 1 year. The effect of this would be similar to volcanic ash, a volcanic explosion. And I'm going to go into a bit of what that has looked like in history, because if you understand what that meant historically, especially, it's one thing if it's in one area of the world, but the entire Earth, that is a whole nother issue. That is a whole nother issue. Just black skies. In the past, that has caused some of the biggest famines and some of the biggest plagues in human history. That was historically part of one of the greatest disasters in the history of humankind, caused by something very similar to that effect, that volcanic ash blocking out the sun and what that meant. But again, they're developing it. They are actually developing this. And, again, it's ironic they want to seed the stratosphere with aerosols from the very people who told us aerosols were burning a hole in the ozone layer. But meanwhile, as the video notes, they want to fly airplanes over, leave chemical trails in the sky as the delivery method. And let me show you another story talking about that idea of the delivery method. This is Live Science in 2018. I should note, too, they say this is not even expensive to do. They believe that they could almost already do this. They believe the ability to do this is not far off, and it would be cheap to do it, and currently there are no regulations preventing such an action from taking place, which is why they do want to start trying to regulate it, making sure that nobody can, not just anybody can go and fly a plane overhead and do something like that. Let me show you Live Science in 2018. They said this: we could spray cheap chemicals in the air to slow climate change. Should we? And they said those are the conclusions of a paper published November 23rd in the journal Environmental Research Letters by a pair of researchers from Harvard and Yale universities. It's the deepest and most current study yet of stratospheric aerosol injection, also known as solar dimming or solar engineering. Solar dimming, dimming the sun. That's the spraying of chemicals into the atmosphere to reflect the sun's heat back into space, mimicking the global cooling effects of large volcanic eruptions. The researchers found that humanity could, using this method, cut our species' annual contributions to the greenhouse effect in half. at a price that states and large cities spend all the time on highways, subways, and other infrastructure projects, a total of about $3.5 billion over the course of the next 15 years to develop the technology. In other words, it's not comparatively to what they're spending money on. This is not comparatively expensive. And these climate conspiracy theorists believe that this is their apocalypse theory. It's basically an apocalypse cult, is what it is. And this is how they're viewing the kind of final synthesis and their ritual of trying to protect us from the environment. It says most of those funds of the $3.5 billion that it would cost to develop this technology, which notably this was in 2018, and since the publishing of it, again, Bill Gates is financing it and has even launched some tests on the deployment of it. They say most of those funds would go into building planes, the airplanes, capable of carrying big tanks of aerosol spray into the stratosphere, about double the cruising altitude of a Boeing 747. Because, again, it would have to be higher up that they would spray this, not the normal height that an airplane would be flying. They say once the tech is ready, the technology is ready, the researchers found the project would then cost another $2.25 billion or so each following year, assuming the effort would run for the next 15 years. In other words, if they were to spray these chemicals into the stratosphere, it would cost, it would last about 1 year. And they would want to do it year by year for 15 years. If they did it every year for 15 years, it would only cost $2.25 billion, which is not a lot of money. And that would be coating essentially the entire Earth's stratosphere with these chemical aerosols, creating this barrier. It's not a lot of money, especially when you consider 15 years, and considering as well that they want to block out the sun for 15 years. Now, essentially what they're talking about, folks, and this is where it gets wild, is chemical trails left by airplanes. Now, maybe we could come up with an easier name than solar geoengineering, something for chemical trails left by airplanes, maybe like chemtrails or, something like that, something a little simpler. Although they note it would have to get into the stratosphere. The height most airlines allegedly would have, left chemtrails enough for it to stay. Now, when it comes to the, I'm partly joking here, but when it comes to the idea of chemtrails, because people believe that airplanes are leaving chemical trails already, which are poisoning people and doing things like this, right? One thing they say, which actually I found very curious, they're saying this. They say if you deploy material at 35,000 feet, say where your 737 flies, it rains back down in a few days because it's just being acted on by gravity, and it's according to Live Science. They say if you get up into the stratosphere, on the other hand, then it stays aloft for a year or 18 months. They say this, incidentally, is one of the reasons that chemical trail conspiracy theories, they're literally talking about spraying chemicals into the stratosphere using airplanes, which mistakenly link chemicals to secret government plans to modify the weather, are so implausible, he added. Anything sprayed at the height at which jetliners would fly would disappear within half a week. So in other words, folks, this proposal, this solar geoengineering proposal, is what the conspiracy theorists actually believe they would do, and it just so happens that they're planning to do it. So now I know that when people talk about chemtrails, I don't think they're talking about blotting out the sun for a full year. They're talking about just seeding the atmosphere with chemicals to, affect people's health. I noted that Joseph Douglas actually did a lot of research on the Soviet programs, including from their actual documents, and how they were actually researching things like this. Although, as far as I understand, they were looking more at putting it in water supplies than they were into the atmosphere. But, the idea is that if were you to spray chemicals into the atmosphere, not in the stratosphere, not that high, into the sky, that essentially would rain down within a week, meaning that maybe they have research stuff as well, but who knows. But back to the point, right? Aside from that whole thing, right? Back to the point. The important part with this is they're looking at doing this every year for 15 years. They're not currently planning to do it, but they are doing experiments on doing it. The money is not very much. They would need to do it comparative to most climate change proposals. And again, it's seen as a pretty drastic measure, one which they're creating many technologies to do. Now, the important part with this is that they're saying it would mimic the effects of a large volcanic explosion. And I want to talk about what that has looked like historically, because as the CNBC video noted, where they actually show that video graphic I showed to you a minute ago that Bill Gates was working on, where they would fly these airplanes and blot out essentially the entire Earth's stratosphere using these chemical aerosols. What would that look like? Now, they noted that would cause probably famine, it would cause crop failures, it would cause other problems like that. And they're saying again that the effect of this would mimic that of a large volcanic explosion. Now, this would not be just one large volcanic explosion. This would essentially be what we've seen historically of large volcanic explosions, but everywhere on Earth. Everywhere on Earth. And I'm going to show you what that looked like historically, when we have actually seen in the past situations like that. What was it like for humankind when similar effects have in fact been seen? This is Science Magazine, and they're saying why 536, the year 536, was the worst year to be alive. And this was 1 year. Remember, they're talking about if they do this, it lasts 1 year to 18 months. This was what it was like in 1 year back in 536 AD. It says, ask medieval historian Michael McCormick what year was the worst to be alive, and he's got the answer. 536, not 1349 when the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, not 1918 when the flu killed 50 million to 100 million people, mostly young adults, but in 536. In Europe, it was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year, says McCormick, a historian and archaeologist who chairs the Harvard University Initiative for the Science of the Human Past. They say a mysterious fog plunged Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia into darkness, day and night, for 18 months. And remember, folks, this stratospheric program they want to launch would last 1 year to 18 months. So this is actually a good view of what this would look like. Now, remember, this is 1 year to 18 months, and they want to do it for 15 years. This is what it looked like for just 18 months. They say, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during the whole year, wrote Byzantine historian Procopius. Temperatures in the summer of 536 fell 1.5 degrees Celsius to 2.5 degrees Celsius, initiating the coldest decade in the past 2,300 years. Snow fell that summer in China. Crops failed. People starved. The Irish Chronicles record a failure of bread from the years 536 to 539. Then, in 541 AD, bubonic plague struck the Roman port of Pelusium in Egypt, what came to be called the Plague of Justinian, spread rapidly, wiping out 1/3 to 1/2 the population of the Eastern Roman Empire and hastening its collapse, McCormick says. Historians have long known that the middle of the 6th century was a dark hour and what used to be called the Dark Ages, but the source of the mysterious clouds has long been a puzzle. Now, a ultra-precise analysis of ice from a Swiss glacier by a team led by McCormick and glaciologist Paul Majewski at the Climate Change Institute of the University of Maine in Orono has fingered a culprit. At a workshop at Harvard this week, the team reported that a cataclysmic volcanic eruption, hear that, folks? A volcanic eruption in Iceland spewed ash across the northern hemisphere early in 536. Two other massive eruptions followed in 540 and 547. The repeated blows, followed by plague, plunged Europe into economic stagnation that lasted until 640, 100 years of disaster. When another signal in the ice, a spike in airborne lead, mark a resurgence of silver mining, as the team reports in Antiquity this week. So in other words, the program that they want to launch is very similar to what happened in 536. because, again, they want to mimic a large volcanic explosion, which in 536, the worst year to be alive, they attribute now to a large volcanic explosion, which happened across 3 years. They also say this was only 18 months, and the program they want to launch mimicking that effect would last 1 year to 18 months. So they want to manufacture, it seems, the worst year to be alive in human history. One that, again, killed about half of Europe, and doing this on a global scale. Not only do they want to do it for that 1 year to 18 months, they want to do that repeatedly for, again, 15 years. And a bit more on that, because the effect of it wasn't just crop failures and other things, but also plague. And even the plague now is being seen as connected to the effect of the volcanic ash. In other words, that not only was, again, crop failure and so on attributed to the effect of blocking out the sun, but so was the virus that spread during that time, the plague that killed a huge number of people as well. The Sun UK said this in 2019. They said, bubonic boom, worst year to be alive, caused by ancient volcanic eruption that plunged the world into darkness and may have led to plague that killed 50 million. And on the plague part, because this is around the same study, but on the plague part, they say a devastating plague that killed up to 50 million people may have spread across medieval Europe thanks to an explosive volcano. The eruption in 536 AD, again, as we just discussed, belched out so much ash and rock that it blocked out the sun over the continent, providing the perfect conditions for widespread disease and famine. Scientists have long known that a volcano in Iceland was likely responsible for what medieval scholars have called the worst year to be alive. But in a new study, experts claim to have located the site of a second volcano that contributed to the 6th century catastrophe. And they state further in, a lack of sunlight meant crops stopped growing, leading to famine and a collapse of the global economy. Some experts even believe the eruptions are linked to a major plague pandemic. The Justinian plague, the one we discussed before, they believe may have been caused by that. They say it started in 541 AD and killed around as many as 50 million people in just 12 months, 1 year, as it spread across the Mediterranean. So, in other words, they're acknowledging in these new studies, one, that again, this would mimic the effect of a large volcanic explosion. Two, that will last 1 year to 18 months, mimicking, ironically, again, 536 AD and the disaster that struck the world during that time, recreating what was one of the worst disasters in recorded human history that we know of. In addition to that, again, causing a pandemic, which killed about 50 million people, and replicating that not just in Europe, where most of this was focused, at least based on our records, even though it was to some extent in Asia and so on, but the entire world. And again, this was 18 months. Imagine doing that for 15 years. They're acknowledging as well that the effect of Bill Gates's financed plan, that it would likely have some of the same effects, notably crop failures, notably famine. They don't say plague, but again, the plague, one of the plagues was attributed as well to that disaster. Now, why would you want to wipe out half the world's population? You know, I assume you'd have to be some kind of crazy eugenicist who believes that humans are a disease on the face of the planet that need to be partially eradicated for the future survival of the race, which ironically many of these people believe in, unfortunately, including Bill Gates, wants to reduce the human population, as he's publicly stated. Now, I'm sure they're considering all of this, of course, because presumably they know the history of such effects if they're acknowledging that they believe this could have a similar effect to large volcanic eruptions. Presumably, if they're talking about solar geoengineering and blocking out the sun for 18 months, they've studied what solar geoengineering through natural causes, volcanic eruption, as they, again, note in their own research. They probably know what that looked like. And they also know some of the possible outcomes of that, which they also admit. Presumably, they're aware that if they do this, they could probably kill half the world's population. But again, they're moving forward with it regardless. Anyways, folks, wild stuff. I apologize to be the constant bearer of bad news. I feel bad. Maybe we'll do that puppy video again. Or maybe we'll do that puppy video one of these days. I personally, given all of this having been said, I personally do believe that things will be changing. I don't believe these things are going to succeed. Frankly, I do think there's a moral awakening happening among people, and I think it's global. And I think that the crazy behavior, a lot of these wild groups, is really a sign of weakness. And I'll emphasize that again. That being said, folks, I appreciate all of you. Thank you again so much for being here. As a quick reminder, too, the documentary, The Real Story of January 6th, is still free. So I know all of you are on Epic TV, but if you have friends or family who haven't seen it and you'd like to have them watch it, be sure to send it to them, because it's only free for a few more days. They currently do not have to register or become members to watch it. Again, that's just for the rest of September, so send that out, let people know, get the word out on it. I'm also going to have some new announcements pretty soon on a special feature and a new documentary that I've been working on for almost 2 years now. So a lot of big stuff in the works, some big announcements pretty soon. And folks, as always, thank you so much for being here. Also, please don't forget to share this video. It really helps us. That said, as always, tomorrow and the next day, tune in for interviews. We have some good stuff lined up as well. As always, folks, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.